Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Front Page. I'm joined here in our central London studio by John Harding and James Stevens, and I'm Racing Post editor Tom Kerr. They used to call August silly season, a time of year where nothing much happened and the newspapers were full of stories about humorously sized vegetables and surfing dogs. Well, no more. August now is a month of crisis. The newspapers are full of everything cost of living, of drought, of pictures of rivers across Europe running dry. And in racing, it's little exception. The bad news seems to keep on coming. The same forces which are affecting the wider world are affecting racing, but we also have a few of our own homegrown crises. But thankfully, there's also some brighter news. We have York Ebor meeting this week and the return of the world's highest rated racehorse, Baaeed. So this week, we are going to be doing the same thing we do every week. We'll each propose the story which we think was the most important from the last week, the story that ought to be on the front page. We'll then tear each other's ideas to shreds, and at the end of it, I'll determine which one gets the crown. So without further ado, we will crack on. And John, you're going to propose the first story this week.
Yeah, so my story this week relates to a column written by Ed Walker in the Racing Post Weekend, a very punchy column in which he reacts to the news of trainers leaving the sport, Joe Chewett and Harry Dunlop, both calling it a day due to sort of financial difficulties and a dwindling string, which points to the forces at play here, the wider issues facing racing. And he made some very interesting points. Point one would be, he said, we're heading towards the rise of what he calls a super stable of a dwindling number of trainers having 300 to 500 horses, while the smaller operations, which we know bring so much colour to the sport, being forced out and put to the wayside. He also criticised the leadership structure of the sport as an extension of this. And he's sort of nodded to a running theme that we've had, which is the inertia at the top of the sport, this lack of urgent change at a time when racing so desperately needs it, with small field sizes and poor prize money and a myriad of things that need solving. And he's essentially saying that the leadership structure is such that nothing can ever really get done. And this is a point that was taken, or I put to the National Trainers Federation Chief Executive Paul Johnson, who said that he was worried that, firstly, that more smaller trainers might follow suit due to the economic situation, due to the situation in racing. But also he just called for that urgency, like Ed Walker, that something has to happen between the BHA, the race courses, and the thoroughbred group, which is the participants, owners, trainers, jockeys, that form that tripartite structure. He says something needs to happen more urgently. We need a long-term plan, yes, but we need it soon because the situation is getting worse and more smaller trainers, more people might be forced out of business. So really interesting situation, and part of this wider theme of we have all these problems on the table, everybody is very good at pointing them out, but what is going to be done about it? Now, we have the BHA strategy review, or the broader strategy review, rather, the whole sports strategy review, which includes those groups, various groups that I've mentioned there. That is underway, but rather nondescript at the moment. We don't quite know what that's going to look like, and indeed when it's going to be implemented. Well, not ideally, but the current projection is that might not happen until 2024. Hence the calls for, please, more urgency, quickly.
And a lot of calls for urgency, not a huge amount of response, but we did find out something this week which was quite interesting. There was an interview by Martin Crudders on Thursday. Martin Crudders is the chief executive of Arena Racing Company, which owns a large number of race courses in Britain. Tell us a little bit what he said, because he gave us probably the most insight we've had so far about where this is going, and perhaps crucially, where the problems might lie as well.
No, absolutely. So he was referring to the strategy review, which essentially is about how can we restructure, or not necessarily restructure, but how can we sharpen up that tripartite agreement? How can we create a situation whereby decisions can actually be made rather than back and forth between, okay, the racecourses don't agree with the thoroughbred group, the BHA doesn't agree with this, and we can never get a majority, the wheels always get stuck when they need to be moving at their smoothest. So he was saying that what needs to happen is we need to get the racecourses and the thoroughbred group, very pointedly he didn't mention the BHA, which I'll come on to, we need to get those two parties into a room and decide the best way forward for the sport. Now, I understand that there will be a meeting to that effect in mid-September, and that the BHA will be involved, despite Cruddis not mentioning them in that interview. And one of the key issues, I think, and from conversations that I've had, will be the role of the BHA in commercial matters, which is obviously a very hot topic relating to this broader question of what is the BHA, what is its role in governance, how much say can it have on what decisions racecourses make commercially, how much sway can it have in terms of getting behind the thoroughbred group or opposing the thoroughbred.
And when we talk about commercial decisions, I think it's important to be clear in this. What people generally are referring to is the fixture list, which is the sport's most powerful commercial lever. And Martin Cruddis was actually really quite explicit that he did not think the BHA should have any involvement in commercial decisions. He said it's for race courses and horsemen to determine the future of the sport. James, do you think that's right?
Not for me. I think that we need to go forward with a body that can have the full power to know and understand everything. We're in a situation now where we've got different parties wanting different things, and if they just can't agree, then nothing changes, and that's exactly where we are. Just as we said at the top, Ed Walker said, personally, I think that the time has called for a sort of an emergency state. You know, we've seen the field sizes go down. We're seeing the attendances dropping. A really good line from your piece was from Paul Johnson, is it hard to think of a single key performance indicator going the right direction? You know, how serious is that? You know, the trainers are leaving and there's not really any light at the end of the tunnel, as it seems at the moment. So I think that the idea of we've got power, and not coming together and having someone to say, right, well, I've listened to both parties and made my own opinion, and this is what's going to happen. That sort of leadership, I think we're really lacking, and I think that the way the sport will progress and get out of this sort of situation is if we can listen to all parties and then someone can make an informed decision.
Which is exactly what we're not going to get if what Martin Cruddis said was correct. We're going to go from basically the current governance structure, which is universally agreed to be absolutely rubbish, because you basically have governance by veto, where the race courses and all the horsemen can basically stop anything they don't like, to a fairly similar model where rather than having governance by veto, you're going to have governance by committee. This is what I keep hearing. I keep hearing this idea that we return to basically splitting up the race courses and splitting up the thoroughbred group into their component parts, and everyone has a vote, and it's basically governance by majority. But you know, the old joke about a camel being a horse designed by a committee sort of sums up how effective committees are generally regarded as being about running things. And I think everyone in racing, or certainly people who aren't involved in the governance of racing, agrees that one of the biggest flaws we have is this constant lowest common denominator decision making, where you cannot do anything which anyone disagrees with, really, because they'll stop it. So if we get a model that doesn't involve, as you say, James, having someone who can ultimately say, right, we've considered all the evidence and our decision based on that is that this is the right thing to do for the sport, and that party has to be unclouded by sort of self-interest and commercial judgment. I think if we don't get that, are we just dooming ourselves to another sort of decade of the same discussions, of the same inertia, or is there reason for hope here, John?
Well, I happen to agree, but the question remains of which body is going to take that responsibility for long-term decision-making. Now, you'd think the BHA would be best positioned for making the long-term decisions in the interests of the sport simply because it doesn't quite have the same commercial, it's not being run quite like a business. So the racecourses are going to look at their own accounts and go, they might be more willing, in theory, to take kind of short-term gain decisions because they've got people to please, they need to make money. Trainers, owners, whatever as well, they equally have they kind of have a financial vested interest in certain things happening, and you're going to have this situation with the racecourses and the thoroughbred group. They're going to butt heads because they're run in they've got different ambitions and they're run in different ways. The racecourses, it's not fair to label all racecourses in the same way because they all have different models, which is very interesting as well, whether they need to be split up. But they have completely different kind of approaches to these things. The racecourses might benefit from more fixtures in theory, whereas the trainers are saying we haven't got the horses to fill them. You're going to have this butting of heads all the time. whereas the BHA can potentially be that body that has oversight. But the vibes that we're getting are the racecourses do not want the BHA anywhere near commercial stuff.
Yeah.
And if the thoroughbred group do, ahead of this meeting in September, we've already got a fairly big hurdle to overcome, and we haven't even really got into the big issues that we're supposed to be dealing with.
This is it. It was a pretty depressing interview in that respect, because it indicates, despite all this urgency, despite this sort of universally agreed need for change, the change we're actually going to be confronted with whenever they eventually get around to letting us know about it sounds like it will probably actually just be a variation on the current system, which does not work. Let's hope for better. There are good people involved in trying to resolve this. We should emphasise that it's not for want of trying, but the sort of mood music is pretty grim right now, I have to say. Just to wrap this one up though, let's bring this back to Ed Walker's original column, which really struck a chord in the industry, prompted a lot of comment from other trainers and from observers and fans of the sport. Two questions. First of all, we had a proposal from Marcus Tregoning that a solution to this would be to cap the number of horses you can have in a yard. Is that a goer, James?
It's an option. I think it's something that we can look at. We need to watch this sort of space a bit. I mean, let's not forget, I think we've talked about the size of a stable, but if you remember going to jumps, you've got a lot of British owners. Think of Cheveley Park, where they train in Ireland. So I wonder if we have restrictions, whether that would knock on that effect, because obviously we've got a lot of good horses that are being trained in Ireland, less so on the flat, but more so on the jump. So that's something I'm a bit cautious of. People want the idea of a big name trainer. They like the idea of a trusted old figure who can, I've got the big Derby.
And if someone can't get their horse with Paul Nicholls and then they decide to have it with Willie Mullins, you're not really benefiting anyone, are you?
No. So it's something to be wary of. I'm personally like the idea of more trainers, more going around. I don't like to see a race when you've got multiple names on the race card and you're sort of going to yourself which one's which. So I can see the point. I just think that sort of restriction at this point in time is probably not necessary. I don't think that it would necessarily change things instantly. I think that we need to watch the horse population, we need to watch what's going on before we start changing things, because the last thing we want to do is put off a big buyer who say, well, I've always had my horses with Paul Nicholls or Nick Henson, I'm now going to buy less. That's the last thing we need, is telling owners not to buy horses. So a little bit wary about that for me, but possibly
it's a lovely idea, isn't it? And it makes it seem like a sort of utopia where the love's spread around and everybody gets a crack at it. But I'm slightly wary, because it's a business. That's how it works. And if these larger operations have obviously done the work to build and build and build, you can't curb ambition, really. For me, you can't. That would be my concern, is that people go, well, okay, I'll just stick to this number, and they don't want to go more and more and build. And it's a competitive industry, and quite rightly, it needs to remain competitive. So that's the question when you're looking at curbing numbers. Does this limit in some way? Does this limit the competition? Does this make it look as though we're sending a message of, well, you're big enough, you're successful enough, just that's enough now?
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to put people off in that sense. But it's certainly worth looking at, and it's worked elsewhere, hasn't it? In Japan, and it seems to be a fairly competitive.
And you've got things such as salary caps in other sports, which are introduced to provide some level of equality across the sport. So I think it's worth looking at, but I think something like that would potentially have unintended consequences. Last question, John. Mark Johnston, among others, has sort of said there's actually there's probably too many trainers. Is that the brutal truth? Is this just sort of natural wasted? Is Darwinian economics in action? And these trainers are always going to be some trainers going out of business?
I think you are always going to get some trainers going out of business, because there's not enough horses to go around, clearly. But if we're talking about how level the playing field is and the issue that's affecting, I think it's more a case of there might be too many races as opposed to too many trainers. Myself, that strikes me as a more pressing issue.
We're certainly seeing that right now.
Yes.
Yeah. Right, second story this week, guys, and it's my story this time, and I'm looking slightly ahead rather than backwards, slightly unusually, because I think the biggest story is the return on Wednesday of the world's highest rated racehorse, Baaeed. He's unbeaten in 9 and he's stepping up beyond a mile for the first time. He's following this Frankel route, as we keep saying, in the Jumpman International. He's only 2-5 to win despite stepping up, but perhaps that's not unsurprising given he's the world's highest rated horse. But he's facing perhaps his toughest test, particularly in the shape of Mishrif, who of course is proven over the trip and has great form all over the world. Now, this story which I'm actually referencing hasn't been in the paper. It was actually our Members Club email, which Members Club Ultimate subscribers get every day. And on Wednesdays, Paul Keeley takes over the hot seat. And he argued in that typical fearless Keels way, I don't care if he's 2-5, I'm going to be taking him on with Mishrif. And he said, we all know the mile division is weak, and Mishrif at his best is a different league to the horses Baaeed is so far beaten. He gives short shrift to the idea that Baaeed is going to improve for going up in trip. He says everyone assumes this, but there's basically, that's opinion rather than fact. And he also is absolutely brutal about the idea that Baaeed sort of saves something for himself and only does just enough. Paul Keeley has no time for that argument. He thinks you've seen Baaeed win by wide margins in the past. He's not doing it this year, and that altogether gives him reason to take on Baaeed with Mishrif at 4-1. So, simple question, guys. John, you first. Baaeed at 2-5 or Mishrif at 4-1?
I think, you know, without being the finest tipster in the world, and certainly not Paul Keeley levels, I think at the prices you have to look at Mishrif, but I'm personally of the belief that Baaeed will win. For me, it's more a case of how he wins is what interests me. Certainly with the Frankel comparison, which I know has been battered away a fair bit, and they're very different horses, and they've each got their own achievements, etc., etc. But if he wins by half of the track and really does improve for a step up in trip, then that will get me excited. But it's more likely, I think, that he'll tough it out in his usual way, and
yeah.
I personally can't see him being beaten, but it's famous last words, isn't it?
Well, wouldn't we love if he won by half the track? I mean, that'd be fantastic. What do you see happening, James?
If I was asked the same question, I'd probably take Mishrif. Actually, I think he was exceptional last season, and I know he didn't quite fire in the King George, but his run in the Eclipse was very good, and that looked quite a decent race. And Paul is right. I think the mile division is considerably weaker. You know, people talk about Frankel. I always look back at Celebration and think what a great horse he was, that he was beaten by a margin.
Would have been a superstar.
I know. And perhaps what we just discussed, if Marco Botti could have held on to him as well, I suppose, what could have been. But I think Mishrif is a really good horse to have in the race. I think it's really good for York. It's good for Baaeed almost, because this is a horse that's internationally recognised. You know, he's gone over across the world. People know him. You know, this is a week where British racing's put in the spotlight a bit. You know, we've got the world watching. They've all come to see the highest rated racehorse. To go and beat Mishrif, a horse who's performed in Asia to a high level on the Saudi Cup, who's gone and won a Group 1 in Britain as well. He won the French Derby, didn't he? So he's a horse that, you know, you can't knock him anyway. You can't say, he's beaten nothing. This is a real top horse. And he really sets that sort of bar for Baaeed to go against. Exciting times. Please don't compare it to Frankel. I'm not having that just yet. I need to see a bit more.
You understand, though, why people want to do the comparison to Frankel. It's like, you know, Frankel, the horse of a century, but also the last flat horse, and even notwithstanding Enable, who I absolutely adored, and I think racing adored, but perhaps didn't resonate beyond. The last horse that really sort of leapt beyond the bounds of our sport and became a public property. I think it's fair to say Baaeed's not there yet. Can he get there? If he sort of, you know, if he goes and wins international, could we see Baaeed start to, you know, intrude into the broader sporting and public consciousness?
I hope so. I think the idea of that unbeaten run, the idea of a superstar, is something that's, you know, I think the best stories in sport are sometimes the simplest ones. You know, this is a horse who's really, really good. He's beating everything by miles. You know, this is a superstar. You've got to watch him do his thing. That's quite an interesting sell. You know, the sort of the Kauto Denman was a great one because it was the rivalry from the horses who live next door to each other. The simple ideas do well. I hope he can, because I think it's going to be good for the end of a flat season. You know, it can sometimes dip a bit. You know, we've done all the classics. You know, with Ledgers coming up, and suddenly it dips. To have Baaeed's unbeaten record still going, probably even until the last day of the season officially. It's going to be interesting, but the one horse you'd love to see turn up was Desert Crown, so it's unfortunate that he's not turning up.
It is a shame. But John, is there anything more racing could be doing to sell its superstars? I don't just mean Baaeed here. I mean generally. Because we know that these horses are the way into the sport. You mentioned Courteau. Lots of people in their sort of 20s and 30s owe their involvement in the sport to Courteau, or they owe it to Denman, or they owe it to Frankel. We know these are the biggest cheerleaders and recruiters for the sport. So, John, what this is a really simple question for you, but what could we do to make these stars a bigger impact on the stage?
Well, I think a lot of the story of these horses comes down to their connections in the first instance, and I know a lot of one thing, when we have the comparison to Frankel, it's very easy to shoot it down and go, well, he's not Frankel, he's done his own thing, but actually it's okay to compare him and say he's not quite as good. That's still a valid comparison. It's a useful yardstick, just as how he gets on against Mishrav will be as well. So things like that, comparison, stats, that's a good way of selling these horses and their achievements. Another, as I mentioned, is the connections, and I'd imagine it does get a little bit tiring being asked about the same horse all the time, but there are worse positions to be in than training the best racehorse in the world. So there's a responsibility, and also indeed a pressure on William Haggis and the people associated with the horse to sell it, tell us about. People are fascinated by these good horses, and they're fascinated by unbeaten horses. We want to know what they're like at home, as ridiculous as that sounds. We want to know what they're like on a race day, what they could achieve, we want to compare them. We want to just know everything about them and put their achievements in perspective, because that's how we build excitement. And I had a very interesting conversation with Rod Street for a story not long ago with Great British Racing, who of course did a fantastic job pushing Baaeed, as they did pushing Frankel and Stradivarius, and creating a buzz around the equine talent, which is so key for engagement with the sport. And he said nothing resonates quite like an unbeaten horse, but it's usually 10 races or more is when that excitement really starts to hit. That's what they saw with Frankel. When he hit 10 races, kicked on from there, it was right, we've got a serious horse who might be able to go outside of the sport. And I'm hoping Baaeed, who's probably on the threshold of capturing the public imagination, he's just not quite, he's certainly caught racing's imagination, but whether he can get onto the back pages of the Nationals and kind of go to that next level.
It takes a while, doesn't it?
It takes time.
For the sort of wider world to realise that these horses are about. I mean, I remember seeing Frankel leading the 6 o'clock news on the day he retired. And you thought, okay, well, this is the moment he finally broke out. I mean, he probably broke out a little bit before that, but still, he was headlining 6 o'clock news. But he's off the stud, and you think, oh, Christ, if only we had another year. That is the nature of it, I suppose. One other thing Keels mentioned in his piece, which I thought was absolutely spot on, is the fact that he was going to get pelters for saying Baaeed was going to lose. And we do sort of see this, don't we? We see these top horses put on a pedestal, and anyone who sort of takes a pot shot at them is sort of doing something sacrilegious. And listen, racing is obsessive about unbeaten records, and understandably so, because they are so compelling. But it's great. I mean, that's what it's all about, isn't it? It's opinions make this game, and nothing gets people going more than debating the merits of a great horse or potentially great horse. Yeah, no, absolutely. As you say, it is a game of opinions. We've all had the conversations when there's a big race coming up and 2 horses, and I'm that camp and I'm that camp. And were you a Samp Crow fan? I know David Jennings probably is probably thinking about that right now. Dwindling fan base, yes. Yeah, not many left, and that's what's good for the game. It's good to have that sort of healthy opinions, and a horse like this is one that's really easy to understand, really easy to get behind. And you talk there, just to add to your point about centre sport, Japan do a fantastic job with that. That's something that really stands out, as the way the trainers, the owners, the whole industry really push the sport. I know it's different context, and Japanese relationship with horse racing is a lot different to Britain. We've obviously got lots more sport that probably would rank higher in the sort of pecking order of the 6 o'clock news or something. There is always stuff we can do. I think if we can really celebrate our horses a bit more, really push it, I think it's only going to help. But more Baaeeds would be good, wouldn't it? Absolutely. Well, excellent stuff. That will wrap that one up there, and we'll move on to the final story today. And it's a bit of a change. We're going back to the jump season. But this is actually an important story, James. You sort of uncovered it during the week about a meeting which took place earlier this summer between various politicians and police representatives in Cheltenham. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, that's right, Tom. So a story in Friday's paper, I spoke to Chris Nelson, who's the Police and Crime Commissioner in Gloucestershire, and as you said, there was an action plan formed between the Jockey Club, between the local police, the councils and residents and such, because they want to put more attention on certain issues that have been raised during Festival Week. So one of them is sort of the walk back from the racecourse, which is often a stagger for many people. There's lots of bad antisocial behaviour on there. It's urinating, it's stuff, and it's people who live in those places are really being sort of affected. He talked about some of the distress that some local residents have, and you know the festival's there. You know it's 4 days. It's something they need to address. So they're putting more toilets and stuff in, which is good, and marshalling and signage. The key issue was drugs. That's a really worrying trend. Chris actually didn't raise it himself. It was raised by the council. It was something they'd seen. Drugs coming in via the trains into the town. It's something that he said they're going to put more attention on, and that there's no shortage of activities they can do to sort of fight drugs. Drugs on a racecourse, drugs during Cheltenham Festival Week is a serious problem. We talk about attendances in horse racing. We talk about the experience of racegoers. If you are going to go racing and you see sort of drug use, you might not want to come back, and we need people to be enjoying it, and Cheltenham is the flagship meeting of the jump season. It's what people look forward to. It shouldn't be spoilt by other people's behaviour. So I think this is a good step. The final thing they discussed was as well about violence against women. So the Borough Council did a survey, and 72% of women in Cheltenham feel unsafe or nervous at night, and that's in normal time, which is really quite concerning. That's up to 75% during race week. Now it's not a big jump, but it's a significant number. That's 3 out of 4 women don't feel safe in the town. So it's good, I think, that the local police are registering these sort of issues and thinking about what they can do. It's good the Jockey Club are involved. You know, the Cheltenham Festival is a wonderful event because it's not just what happens. You know, it's not just Gold Cup Day. It's not just starts with a triumph and ends with the Martin Pipe. It's a day thing, you know, you go out in the morning, you go out in the evening, it's a feel-good thing, it's a feel-good week, you know, that's what people say, we love the buzz of the Cheltenham Festival, and everyone should enjoy it, and they should want to come back, and unfortunately, there is behaviour that needs to be stamped out, so a step in the right direction, and I hope that the festival would be more enjoyable for those who perhaps don't enjoy it so much last year.
Yeah, I'm always a great defender of behaviour at racecourses, because I think for the amount of booze being consumed, the open site nature of it, and yes, you know, probably the amount of drugs being consumed as well, racecourse crowds actually conduct themselves incredibly well, and trouble is thankfully very rare. Clearly, though, at Cheltenham this year, and Cheltenham generally, you know, there are some issues. I mean, I was saying that every day I walked back from the racecourse into the centre of Cheltenham, and I'd walk down, and there's a bit on Montpellier, coming up to Montpellier, where there are 4 phone boxes together, and people were using them as toilets. They were queuing to use these phone boxes as toilets, and there was literal rivers of piss flowing from them. It was absolutely horrific, and you can imagine if you're a local resident how appalled you'd be by that behaviour. So, you know, clearly there is some antisocial issue that needs to be tackled. The racecourse needs to play a role in this. We don't want the people of Cheltenham deciding that the festival is something they would rather do without. That's not fair on people of Cheltenham, and it's not good for Cheltenham Festival itself. But if we look at this sort of behaviour around sort of antisocial behaviour, John, do you think this is a racing problem? Is it a societal problem? Is it a sports problem?
I think, look, it's a societal problem, isn't it, generally? And it's absolutely a sports problem. We saw people smashing up Wembley before England's Euro final, didn't we? Drinking far too much.
Flares in the bum.
Flares where they're not supposed to be, for uses they're not supposed to be used for.
Absolutely.
Although it made fantastic photos for some of the other newspapers. Yeah, it's a societal problem, certainly drug use generally. It's a sporting problem in that these events generally are people are going to these events perhaps drinking too much, perhaps overdoing it and not conducting themselves properly. And sports, football, racing's not alone in having to work out how best to deal with it and get the correct amount of security on and target these things and nip things in the bud earlier, little flashpoints before they become anything more serious. But I think the nature of racing makes it perhaps unique in that it is a day thing. People are turning up relatively early, starting drinking incredibly early, really. If you think the first races are 1, 2 o'clock, and people might have already had a few pints before then, it's quite a dangerous situation when they're getting to 7, 8, assuming a strike rate of 1 pint per race.
Yeah.
You know,
that's a lot of booze.
They need to be careful. There's things that they can do, and like I think you've got it absolutely right when you say that it is on the racecourse as much as it's on police, as much as it's on the local community or council rather to deal with this. I think racecourses can always invest more in security. They can always do a little bit more, perhaps with serving people who they see. Maybe there's training that needs to happen for their hospitality staff to say, he might have had enough or she might have had enough, you know.
Yeah, it's difficult though, isn't it? Because part of the appeal of going racing for lots of people is it's a fun day out. You often get a little bit dressed up, you know. It's a special occasion, and you know, for better or worse, special occasions in this country generally go hand in hand with drinking copious amounts of booze. Clearly, though, some people dislike that, you know, and there's a cohort of racegoers for whom the copious consumption of alcohol is a negative. James, how do we sort of tackle that? How do we make racing something which is welcoming to both people who want to make a day of it and those for whom the sport is paramount?
Well, I think what racecourses have, and they're lucky to have, is they're big places. So they know that if you do want a quieter experience, you're probably not going to be watching the race in the Guinness Village. You can probably find bits in the track that are more quiet. It's probably about advertising it and sort of advertising this is more of a place where if you want to have a sit down, this might be where to go, you know, and sort of understanding the racecourse and the different areas of it. Often they're sort of more commercial, aren't they? Sort of the hospitality package and stuff. But knowing the racecourse and having that space is good. I mean, as you said, this is a minority. Thankfully, this is a minority of people on sort of a racecourse and in racing. But when there's 280,000 people, it's obviously notable. So yeah, I think that's the way. It's the racecourses are big. The other sort of interesting point with this is, of course, there is a topic in Cheltenham at the minute about the 5th day of the Cheltenham Festival. And
yes, give us an update.
Well, the police mentioned how actually we've seen bar racing, but from people and sort of people within Cheltenham and stuff. You know, the MPs I spoke to were both sort of in favour of it and the money it brings, which is probably, we're talking a good few £1 million, tens maybe, just for having a Saturday at the Cheltenham Festival. I mean, the word is that it would be on a Saturday. I think that's sort of established.
Yeah.
And there was a email that went around to members where there was a few options, one of which was a sort of family-orientated day. I think if I was to run a book, I would have that in as favourite at the minute. Obviously, if they're going to be selling a family day on a Saturday, you need to sort this sort of thing out, because otherwise families won't want to be turning up. But I still think it will happen. But we'll wait and see. I think the important thing to say on that is that they're consulting. They're going to their members. Yeah. They've really gone thoroughly. A lot of people, when we produce a story, thought the writing was on the wall. They've clearly gone in and are doing it all the right ways. They're getting they've got getting the feedback. They're getting the views from various people across the board, including the MPs, including the police. You know, I think they're doing it about the right way, and it'd be interesting to see what decision they come to.
Certainly will, and when that happens, the decision either way, that story certainly will be covered on this show, and I dare say will be the front page. But we have to make a decision for this week, and that heady responsibility falls to me. So I'm not going to go with mine, because I think the last time I did this, I went with mine, and I'm going to develop an awful reputation. I think the Cheltenham antisocial behaviour is a really important story. It's a recurring theme. It doesn't just apply to Cheltenham, it applies to sports events, race courses, town centres generally. It's a huge story, but I don't think we can get away, John, from your story, Ed Walker's warning that more trainers will go to the wall, and the larger sort of crises that taps into in racing. We're still not seeing any answers, and I think until we see those answers, it's going to still be on the front page. So well done.
I would celebrate, but the nature of it is such that wouldn't be fitting.
No, indeed not. Indeed not. And indeed could be antisocial.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us for this week's edition of The Front Page, and thank you very much to John and James for joining me in central London today in the nicely air-conditioned office. Before I go, please do check out the description where you'll find a link to subscribe to Members Club Ultimate, through which you'll get access not only to all the fantastic journalism of the Racing Post news team, but also things like Paul Keeley's weekly email, video replays, a horse tracker, and lots more besides. And please do join us again next week. I'll be in the hot seat again, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.